Welcome back to Massacre on Muriel Court. In this episode, we are going to go way back to when my co-host on Paradise After Dark, Ken, and I spoke to the man behind the documentary 641 Muriel Court. Great documentary, extremely informative. Give this interview a listen and then go watch the documentary 641 Muriel Court. The link will be in the show notes.
It's mostly quiet on Muriel Court, but that wasn't the case in 1966 when Robert Sims, his wife Helen, and young daughter Joy found gagged, stabbed, and shot to death.
Safer politically to leave it alone.
Get in there now. Take care of the problem.
Moronic is the word that comes to mind.
He's accusing two top officials of a cover-up.
Standing back there under the banana tree.
Surveillance video of a 1966 FSU football game may be the key to cracking the code in this case gone cold.
You do that.
And while state officials aren't releasing details regarding suspects or persons of interest, they did stress their commitment to finding the Sims killers.
Oh, I think you did it. All of a sudden you became absolutely down, totally obsessed with that.
It's a case that we would certainly like to see solved, and investigators are actively working on the case.
Okay, so what I was saying is our podcast basically covers unsolved cases, unsolved mysteries, missing people, all in the state of Florida. So we have started looking into the Sims murder, and we obviously came across your documentary, which we watched. I actually rewatched it again today, which is great. Kudos to you. I mean, that's probably the most informative thing that I've found on the whole case, because there's so many twists and turns with it. It's driving me crazy, honestly.
Yeah, it was a lot to sort through, sift through, dig up, etc. Like it's a bear of a case, no doubt.
How long did it take you to put it all together?
I worked on that essentially nonstop for 10 months.
Wow.
Yeah, I was a full-time student at the time, working 2 part-time jobs and doing that, and essentially I didn't have much of a life for that 10 months, but it was well worth it. I was definitely strapped for sleep and food and otherwise, but it worked out.
Yeah, was it for school, or was it just a personal project?
So it did start out as a school project so I was in a documentary production class, and the way the class worked was you came up with an idea for a documentary, and everybody pitched ideas, and the class voted, and based on those ideas that had the most votes, the class would group off and make them. So the Sims murder was what I pitched to the class, and it got votes to be made, and obviously, well into the first couple of weeks, we realized that this is absolutely never going to be done in any way that does the case justice in one semester.
Right.
So, and we sort of got continuously lucky breaks and good leads and documentation and things on the case. So we kept getting more and more information, which was fantastic, but it was also a little bit rough to get it done in the semester, and we did turn something in, but ultimately that was never our goal. Our goal was never this class project. It was more, to make the best piece we could, to do right by the family, the city. I mean, the whole works. And so it really evolved quickly past a class project, and that was really never our main focus, albeit wanting a good grade once at the end of it. But, yeah, we went through it that semester, but ultimately we didn't finish it till long after.
Wow. So what was it that piqued your interest about this case? Why did you pitch the Sims murder?
So I was in the class where you pitched the ideas to the class for a documentary, and I didn't really have any great ideas. but I reached out to a professor and a mentor of mine, Professor Hauk, Davis Hauk, and he is a historian, rhetorician, etc. He knows all sorts of things about Tallahassee, the South, and otherwise. So I figured he would have some kind of good idea laying around, and I told him what it was for, and next thing I knew, he was blowing up my inbox, both my email and on Facebook, with articles about the Sims murder. And, I think at the time, it was 49 years unsolved, and there had been a story on it a few months ago. So he was just loading me up with all this information, all these articles, and how big of a deal this case was. And I actually was a little hesitant at first, but ultimately I went with it, and it was a big undertaking, but it was a worthwhile one.
So do you have, is like true crime or unsolved cases kind of like a passion of yours, or just something that you kind of fell into with this specific case?
It was something I fell into, but I must confess that it's something I would love to do again, and it's something of a passion of mine now. It was so much fun, and it was everything I like about filmmaking and everything I like about any kind of work I do, because it was so research intensive and it was history based. I'm a big history nerd, and so it was really, it became something that I loved and something that I'd love to do again. That's
awesome. You should start a podcast.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's a little bit of know-how there that I may not have. But
yeah. Do you still do films now? Is that what you do?
I do. I'm a filmmaker at an ad agency here at the...
Oh, that's
yeah.
awesome.
So I work in advertising as a filmmaker and editor and shooter. So
Anything?
a little less intensive, a little not quite hour-long documentaries, but I would definitely do a documentary again if the opportunity came up, and I'm always kind of on the lookout. So
that's awesome. Did you in all the research? Okay, first of all, my question is, how did you get all the information that you guys got? Did you just use the public records, or did you have to know somebody, or how did you come across all of the information you gathered?
So here's where things start to get a little dense and a little interesting. So in the state of Florida, you'll have to check the exact year on this statute, but there is a law that says police documents before the year, I want to say 1980. It might be 1979, but I think it's 1980. Documents in police cases before that year are not public record. They're just not. So obviously the Sims case that murder was in 1966. So a lot of relevant documentation is not public record. However, Tallahassee PD and the FDLE were holding up all the documents related to the case because the case happened in 66, but there were interviews and ongoing investigations well into the 80s and 90s. And so an author and a journalist named Henry Cabbage, who's in the documentary, was going to write a book on the case. And he actually sued FDLE, and he sued so he sued law enforcement essentially to release those documents, because legally they should be public record after 1980. And the court ended up siding with Mr. Cabbage, and they had to turn over any documents after that year that's in the statute. And so he was given a box of documents, but he was given a box of documents that were out of order, that were not labeled, not in any kind of organization. So they gave him a box of about 2,000 pieces of paper, and he had to sort through them himself. Well, it was so complicated, and also some other contacts he had with the case sort of fell through, and he ultimately gave up on the book. He ended up not pursuing it anymore. But I contacted him because I knew I had found, I don't know if it was perhaps Professor Hauk or somewhere online that I had found that he was working on the book. And I reached out to him, and I met him at the Salty Dog in Tallahassee, and he gave me a cardboard box with Sims written on the side in Sharpie, and it was 2,000 pieces of paper that were police documents that really no one had ever looked through except maybe Henry Cabbage. And so that's when I decided to put all 2,000 of them in order, because I wanted to, crack this open. So I spent about, probably a solid 4 days sorting through the papers and putting them in order, and I put together the documents that were released. So that's how that was a huge, chunk of information, set of documents that really was the foundation of the whole film. But another thing that was really helpful in that box of documents was when Mr. Cabbage was working on his book, he would dig up various people connected to the case, friends, neighbors, classmates, and he would write down their name and phone number. So I had, in this box, I had a bunch of sticky notes with random names and phone numbers, so I just started making calls. I just started calling people cold, and I didn't know who they were or how they were connected, but I knew somehow they were. And, a few of them were gracious enough to talk to me. A few of them even interviewed in the film. There's the three women that were neighbors of the Sims. I mean, they were a random phone call, and they, got together. A couple of them drove a couple hours to get together again for the first time in years just to talk to me. So it was great.
Oh, wow, that's cool. So how did you get a hold of the video of Charlie's confession? Was it in the box?
So that was also in the box from Mr. Cabbage. Yeah. So that was in the form of a DVD. It's a 6-hour interview in total, and I went through and watched the whole thing a couple times. Took extensive notes and time codes on various quotes and things she was saying, and did my best to make sense of that. Which is even from the tidbits you get in the film, it seems crazy. Well, it's even stranger and crazier when you watch the whole thing through, and it's. It is. I mean, it's a very bizarre piece of media, and so I watched through that thing, and but ultimately that came from Mr. Cabbage.
So yeah, because she can be rather sort of annoying when you're sitting there just listening to her talk because it's so lost.
Yeah, and it's very tough to decipher.
Yeah.
If she has an agenda, what her agenda is. I mean, I think I did my best to pull out the bits that seem to be driven by some sort of an agenda, but those are, in the film, it's probably, 5-10 minutes of that versus the 6 hours of them talking, and they go around and around, and Larry Campbell I understand that there was some criticism in Tallahassee, but then and now about Larry Campbell not pursuing them as suspects, but Larry Campbell did his work. I mean, that was a hard-out interview to sit through, to walk her up to the line of many times of almost confessing or saying something incriminating and not, and he did really fine police work to keep her talking, so.
Right. Well, my first thought with the whole thing was she asked, I don't know at what point, she asked if what would happen to her if she confessed, and he told her, well, you'd go to jail. And I was like, duh, don't say that. Not to criticize.
Yeah, that was a big moment. That's a big moment in the interview, no doubt. I mean, that perhaps is a infamous moment, if you will, right. and it probably is, as far as I know, is this case really stuck with Larry Campbell. I mean, he was the first officer on the scene back in the 60s, and then ultimately to be talking to her in the 80s, and then all the way through to the end of his life. I don't want to go so far as to say it haunted him, but I know it was something that stuck with him for people I talked to, and so, I mean, he's probably gone over that interview more times than anybody else, and if there was something he regretted, it may have been that, but I don't know the legality on the other side of that, so I can't say for sure he should have said something different, but it seems like a gap at the end of the day.
Well, based on all of your research and everything that you learned and everything you did for your documentary, do you have a favorite suspect, or any theories?
So, I mean, I will say what I said many times back when the film was being made. The final documentary that we made ended up being about an hour and 3 minutes, and we cover, I want to say 5 suspects, or if you count Vernon Fox and Mary Charles as one, I think we cover 4 then. But half of the film, 30 minutes of that hour, is dedicated to them, and that's for a pretty good reason. I mean, that's where most of the information is, and that's where most of the documentation is based on, and that's what a lot of the story of this case comes down to them. So whether or not I have a favorite, I don't know if I can say, but I think the documentation and the film kind of speak to that, in that it's half of the film for a reason.
Understandable.
Totally understandable. You said on a Reddit thread where you said that I did my best for this to be an objective piece. What is it? I'm trying to read it. But he was off-putting in a number of ways. There were long bouts of the interview where he recounted past relationships with women as he was interested in, dating back to grade school.
Yes.
I just want to hear a little bit more about your encounter with him. Like, because I've read his Reddit threads. I've read his comments on I Did It for Jody. And I even contacted him and he responded to me with some kind of wacky response about banana trees. I don't even...
Oh, yeah. I know about the banana trees. So, when I finished sort of the first phase of this documentary back when I was doing this, I got the bit that I needed to get done for the class, and then I was prepared to take a little bit of a break because it was summer vacation, and I didn't want to worry about it too much more because I knew I wouldn't be trying to release the film until October when it was the 50th anniversary. So I remember being back at my apartment, and my roommate said, "Hey, there's some guy online calling himself Vernon Fox commenting on things." And I'm like, that cannot be real. And so this is early on when Vernon was getting active online. Mm-hmm. So when I found him, the documentary didn't have much press at the time, so I just commented on one of his posts or shot him a message and said something along the lines of, "Hey, I'm working on a movie on this, I'd love to talk to you." And he immediately got back to me and said, "There's nothing to talk about." And I said, "Okay, well, here's my email if you change your mind." And about 2 days later, he emailed me and wanted to make sure I understood that there was nothing to talk about. And I said, "Okay, well, if you want to talk to me, here's my phone number." And about 2 days later, he gave me a call. And I was on the phone with him for about 35 minutes, and I almost didn't say a word. I just let him talk, and he talked and talked and talked. I didn't have anything recording, but he just talked about everything from his father to him growing up. He was all over the place in a way, and I asked him, I said, "Hey, you like talking about this. I think it'd be great to get your side out. We should meet and talk sometime on camera." And he said, "No." And then he called me back a couple days later and said, "Yes." And so I knew going into it I was getting myself into something that was going to be a little bit out of the norm because he was an interesting character. But when we did sit down and talk and interviewed him, he was adamant that he had nothing to do with this, but the things that he did talk about, and he was constantly going back and recounting past relationships, talking about different girlfriends or girls he was into in grade school or girls when he was on a school bus. I mean, just constantly going back and referring to women in very objective, sexualized ways. And it was off-putting, but also just a little out of the blue because obviously I wasn't asking anything to do with that. I was there for a reason, and I wasn't hiding that reason by any means. But you ask him what kind of car he was driving that night, and next thing you know, he's telling you a story about his third grade class, and it was strange, and that's not really something that's up for debate and to be denied by him because I have all the footage still. So
yeah,
there is definitely an off-putting characteristic to him, and whether or not I can say that's incriminating, obviously not, but he was a difficult person to talk to.
So did you get him locked into any kind of timeline or story about where he was and what he was doing that night?
So I did, and that, to me, is the most interesting part of my documentary that ultimately I think is the weakest part, because I attempted to, if I could go back and redo that, and I've actually toyed with it, is going back and doing it over with some voiceover work, because I did my best to show it visually, but what happened is between Vernon talking to the police in the 1960s, which I have access to some of those documents from some sources I had in Tallahassee, to Vernon talking to the police in the 1980s, which I had access to from Henry Cabbage, and then what Vernon told me on camera in 2016 are three different accounts in nuanced ways, but ways that are kind of important. One of the big ones is that it would seem his memory has gotten better and better as he's gotten older. In the 60s when he was interviewed just a night after, the day after, he didn't know much, didn't know what time they got home, didn't know when they left the movies, and when he got to the 80s, it was, I left the movies then, and then he talked to me and said he remembers getting out of the car at 11:07 p.m., which is interesting because in the 1960s, Mary Charles LaJoy wrote in her calendar where she took her birth control that she took her birth control at 11:05 p.m. So one of them was lying, and it would seem that in 1966, writing in her journal, Mary Charles had less to be lying about than did Vernon Fox in 2016. So, I mean, even if you're talking a difference of 2 minutes, but it doesn't matter, because these are their stories, these are their alibis, and you have, in the three, what I'm referring to is like the three different, you have nuances of when they left the movies, what movies they saw. All of a sudden, Vernon Fox was taking them out to, or took Mary Charles out to Dog Lake, and apparently they had intercourse or whatever, and, those are, Dog Lake's far away from where they were and where the houses were. And so even if that did or didn't happen, that time seems to get all polluted, and ultimately, in the 80s, Mary Charles said that they had never had intercourse at that point. And so it's very strange, and whether they stood to gain something by lying about that part of their lives or not is beyond me and not my business. But the story ultimately changes. Between 1966, 1980, I want to say 89 when she interviews, and then 2016 when he spoke to me. Because it's worth noting that when Mary Charles did that video interview in 1989, Vernon Fox was questioned again as well. And so we have documents from the 80s of his response to questions in the 80s too. And those three different time periods have different nuanced accounts.
Okay.
Yeah, usually your memory gets worse, but in this situation it gets better. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, its details sort of creep in and seem to solidify themselves, which is...
Well, and here's the thing.
It seems a little bizarre to me.
I reached out to him on Reddit the exact same time I reached out to you. And he told me that they went to the movies. The credits were playing at 10:45. It was 10:45 when Herman looked out his window and saw muzzle flashes. And I don't know who Herman is. I can't figure that out. Do you have any idea who that is?
I don't. The best I can say is that it must be a neighbor.
But I can't find anything about this.
That would have been something that was probably buried in documents from the 60s that I didn't have access to. But he didn't either, so I don't know exactly where he's getting that information. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying I had never heard it or found it in my research.
But then he says that she dropped him off at 11:07. Now, 10:45 to 11:07, what is that? Like 22 minutes? But they somehow went up to Duck Lake and did whatever they did, and then got back to the neighborhood by 11:07.
Right, and it seems... that seems
sense.
Oddly specific. It doesn't make sense, and even if you ignore the part about going to the lake, I mean, there's evidence of the person working the movie ticket saying they left during the movie, not waiting to the credits. Mary Charles back then said that they left sometimes during the movie. They didn't stay for the end of the movie. And then now it's leaving when the credits are rolling, which just doesn't seem right. That doesn't add up. And the fact that he's suddenly pulling 11:07 out seems pretty convenient, given that in the 60s and the 80s he did not have a solid time for when he remembered getting home at all.
Right.
So that seems to be a fabricated bit of memory.
Right.
It's not like it is today. Where everybody, what time it is because it's on phones, watches, and all this stuff. I mean, back then
absolutely
to say 11:07. I mean, what's the odds of knowing the exact time? So I find that a little suspicious.
Absolutely, and to really, if for the podcast and for whatever story you end up telling, if you want to really nail some of these nuances, go to that last segment of the film, and you'll see that I do a few side-by-side comparisons, or one after the other, of documents from different years. And then when you're watching it, it moves too quick. That was an oversight on my part that I would have done differently now. But if you go through, pause it, just kind of click through, you'll see a line pulled out from 1980 right next to a line pulled out from 1966, and it's clearly different things from the same person. So I definitely encourage you to do that, and you can get some of these nuanced and important differences in their stories and their alibis.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely do that. Did you have any pushback from anyone when you were trying to research this case? Like anyone that didn't want to talk or anything like that?
So there was some. The pushback came in the form of not being helpful, and the probably the least helpful bodies were the First Baptist Church of Tallahassee, which is where C.A. Roberts was the reverend, and then ultimately run out of town, and they were not helpful at all. I tried to get in touch with them on many occasions. I tried to set up talks and meetings with their historian, and they always seemed to be out of town. They always seemed to be busy. They always seemed to forget we had a meeting. They never seemed to let me inside. So the church was not very forthcoming at all. And the FDLE was not very helpful at all in any way. I mean, neither was Tallahassee PD. That they, I called and told them what I was doing, told them what my project was, and they said they'd take it up with people, and I'd just never hear back. So I'd follow up and never hear back. And so the pushback came in the form of silence. However, I will tell you one anecdote that didn't make it into the film for a couple reasons, mostly because I was just young and scared. But this is an interesting one. So if you'll remember from the movie, I interviewed Willie Meigs, who was the state attorney at the time. Right. And I interviewed him. I remember the date pretty well. I interviewed Willie Meigs, the state attorney of Florida, on March 12th of 2016. And he told me on March 12th of 2016 that the Sims case is something that he had not thought about in a very, very, very long time. I remember this, but I don't know. It's not something I've looked into. That's been closed for a long time, and it was very, very far from his memory. He seemed to remember one journalist pretty well, and every answer I got from him was, that was a long time, I don't know. Any specific questions he just wrote off because it was too long ago to even have any clue about details. I found out later that summer, in an email from one of my sources, that Willie Meigs was very actively involved in the investigation of the Sims case in February and March of 2016, right when he was talking to me. They had arranged a task force to investigate the case, in fact, and to pursue Vernon Fox and Mary Charles LaJoy. They had arranged a task force, and that task force was broken up by Meigs on March 19th of 2016. So 7 days after he spoke to me, saying he didn't remember anything, he broke up a task force about the thing that had been months in the work in the making. Wow. So if you want to call that pushback, I think that's probably fair to call that pushback.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, and then that kind of...
Yeah, there's definitely politics around this case. Well, there was a lot of politics, and there probably always have been politics around this case that honestly probably could result in a whole other documentary, because...
And that kind of coincides with Jeremy Mutz being fired. From what I've gathered is that he was really hardcore looking into it, and then I know I read something that they were going to let it go, but he wouldn't let it go, and he put together a timeline, he put together all this stuff, and then all of a sudden they fire him.
Yes.
Which
all of that is true. Mr. Mutz was partially responsible for, or probably mostly responsible for, that task force that ended up getting broken up. Mr. Mutz and I talked a lot, and it does seem he got fired for looking into this case, which, is one of the great tragedies of the case, and there are politics at work here that I can't make a ton of sense of, but I'm sure if you reached out to him, he would be able to help you with some of that more. But I can speak to the fact that there were politics in this. There was a sort of not wanting to look into it further, and is the way I see it is that Willie Meigs lied to me about what he knew and what he remembered, because He told me he had not thought about it in a long time, and that just simply wasn't true.
Right. That's interesting. And I wonder why they wouldn't want it. It just seems like, you know, when we do cases, we'll contact, like here, we're in Collier County in Florida. So we'll contact Collier County Sheriff's Office and we'll say, you know, we need this information. And like within 24 hours, they're giving us police reports, 911 calls. You know, it's like they want us to help. Yeah. And I find it strange that it seems like for some reason, some people don't want this to be solved.
That has been the impression surrounding this case for a very long time before I got involved with it.
And I really can't imagine why.
Well, there are a couple of reasons that I can think of, and I don't want any of this to get misconstrued as too specific, but in general, Tallahassee is at least back then, and I should say in 1966, was a small southern town that had a very large university. So Florida State was, I mean, it's the state capital, but Florida State was that town, politically, financially, economically, etc. And Vernon Fox's father started the School of Criminology at Florida State. He was the lead professor at the School of Criminology, which is where all of the police officers and detectives and law enforcement officials went to school and trained and learned. So there was an element of that a lot of the people involved in law enforcement were very close to Vernon Fox Sr. I'm not drawing conspiracy lines and saying that's why Vernon Fox Jr. wasn't prosecuted, but that was an element that can't be ignored.
Right.
Another part of it is the financial part of it, in that that university was the town in so many ways, in so many, you know, political ways and otherwise, that to prosecute a prestigious professor's son just seemed like it was out of the question. And those forces, that sort of stigma about it, seems to even just be around today. You know, those people seem to be gone, but that air of not being able to touch it just seems in place still, and that's something I quite understand. I don't understand why Willie Meggs broke up that task force. I don't know why Mr. Meggs wanted to not look into the case, even though Mr. Mutz had so much great evidence. I don't know why Mr. Meggs lied to me about that, but those are forces that just seem to have not gone away. Huh.
That's an interesting interesting thing that I hadn't really even thought of yet when it comes to.
And I can say that Mr. Mutz will definitely speak to this if you're able to get in touch with him.
Well, we did actually reach out to him on Reddit, but I didn't get a response back, and I didn't have any other contact. I think this is probably going to be a 2 or even 3-part episode because there's just so much.
Oh, wonderful. There is a lot.
Go ahead.
There was a podcast that was done called Terror in the Town, or Terror
in Old Town.
Yeah, Terror in Old Town. And it was up, like as of 9 months ago. For some reason it's missing. Any idea? Did you listen to that or hear that at all?
Yeah, so I actually worked, I won't say closely, none of the effort was mine, but I definitely helped with the gentleman that produced that and made that. I was actually unaware that it was taken down. I had been in touch with him on email as recently as a couple months ago, just sending him various documents and leads and stuff, you know, contacts that I had made and documents that I had scanned and found. So I didn't realize it had been taken down, but he was really into the case, and he was really, really diligent about what he was doing, and really gave it the due attention. It was a fantastic podcast. It's a shame it got taken down.
Yeah, well, we would have loved to listen to it, but we just can't seem...
Don't know why.
It's still there, but when you try and click on it, it says this content has been removed by...
Which leads us to believe more of not conspiracy.
Didn't realize that. No, that's news to me.
Yeah.
And that's all platforms.
Yeah, all platforms. Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, all of them. It's been removed on everything, so we can't find it.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Oh, do you want to tell us where people can find your documentary?
Sure. The documentary is called 641 Muriel Court, which was the Sims address, and that is available for free on Vimeo. We have a Facebook page that I don't do anything with anymore, but you should be able to find the film on there as well. But if you just Google 641 Muriel Court, that's Muriel, you should be able to find the film free on Vimeo.
Okay, perfect. You know what? We'll put that link in our show notes for this podcast. Yeah. So that our listeners can check it out. I definitely highly recommend everyone check it out because it's great.
Yeah, it was great for a student.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
So I think that's all the questions we have. Was there anything else that you wanted to put out there about this case or your documentary or anything?
This is something that was a really, really important time, a really, really important part of my life for a long time, and I'm very glad folks are still talking about it. I'm really glad people like you are putting together podcasts. I'm really glad there's other podcasts about it. I don't want this case to just fall to the wayside of history because it does matter. And when you get close to it, close to the people that it affected and that were surrounding it, this is. I think a lot of the times it's easy to see pictures from 1966 and black and white photos and hear those old dates and think of how far away it is. But I spoke with neighbors and family members and friends and classmates that, lost sleep for years, that raised their children differently because of this case. And at the end of the day, two young girls grew up without parents and without their younger sister because of this, and they're alive and well, and that's not a memory that could ever go away, and that's not a part of their life that could ever be erased. So,
did you ever get a chance to speak with them?
So I did not. There was probably a point at which I could have reached out, and I chose not to because I felt that was a part of their life they wanted to put away.
Mm-hmm. We can appreciate that.
I did get an indirect bit of support from them, and I can't even actually explain what it was. One of them liked something on Facebook that somebody else had written about my film. I have reason to believe they were monitoring what I was up to and what we were doing with the film. Whether they watched it, I do not know. And again, I didn't reach out to them because I felt it wasn't my place to do so.
Right.
I didn't want to, sensationalize the worst thing that ever happened in their life. That wasn't my goal. And it's still not. But at the end of the day, I do think the case is still important, and I do think people putting in work on it are doing good things. So.
Yeah, well, no, we can definitely appreciate that because we've had some cases that we've gotten a little, they've taken up not necessarily 10 months of our lives, but we spend probably 4 or 5 weeks on each case researching and talk to family members, and it kind of I don't know how to explain it. It just becomes important to you, even though it has nothing to do with you. But once you talk to family members and the people involved, it feels like you're involved.
It does. So I know that feeling well.
Yes. But you did a wonderful job with the documentary. That's why I really wanted to talk to you. And I was lucky enough to find you on Reddit. So I'm glad we got to do this.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I do have one more thing to say, actually. I apologize for...
Go for it.
But, so many times throughout this, I've said we. I was the group that I worked on this with, and I'd be absolutely remiss to not include the team that I worked on this with for 10 months. And so I had help along and a kid from Michael Walsh and Elijah Callett, and the three of them put in the long hours with me. Everything from coming up with story ideas to scanning documents to sifting through hours of things. They were just as much in the weeds with this as I was. So I I would hate to not make sure they were included in this. So one more time, that's Deanna Key, Michael Walsh, and Elijah Callett, who were amazing teammates and friends along the way.
Awesome. We'll definitely include them in this recording.
Yeah, they did a great job.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Great job. Join me next week as we look at possible connections to other family murders and even a possible connection to a serial killer we have all heard of but has never been caught. Again, the link to the documentary 641 Muriel Court will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, please consider joining our Patreon page at patreon.com/Palmahawk Media. On Patreon, you'll not only have access to early and ad-free episodes, exclusive content for Massacre on Muriel Court, but also access to everything Palmahawk Media, including Paradise After Dark. Thanks for listening.